Welcome back to Podtalk. We're glad you've joined us once again. You know that we're working on growing generous hearts, and here together we have people who have been at that work, both in their individual lives and in their communities. It's such an honor together to be together with Bob and Pam and Stefan and Peter, and I'm Melanie. Great that we could be together. So Peter, I have heard some things about your interesting neighbors who've been responding with abundance that you've noticed. Tell us about that.
Yes, I've actually been regaling this group with stories of my neighbors from Mexico, and they said, well, you have to tell that on the podcast. So they moved in a couple of years after we did. They're directly behind us, so our backyards are adjoining. And it became quickly obvious they didn't speak much English at all. And we didn't speak Spanish. But, you know, we tried to be friendly and smile and wave and this. And that worked for a while. And then the relationship got a little bit closer. Somehow, Jose's English got a little bit better, and he could ask some basic things and maybe wanted to know something about what to do with this. And we asked him for some help with something. It worked out. It was really improving. And one day they brought over a plate of food that Marita had made, and she's just a really good cook. And we don't know Mexican cooking very well, but we quickly took to it, and realizing that there's a certain level of spiciness that was not to our liking, but no, well, we'll try it. But it was just so good. And then after doing that once, they brought it back again a little while later, and they were all out in the yard, including Grandma from Mexico, Abuelita. So I went out there, and I had been actually learning some Spanish with a phone app since I retired. So I went out there and thought, well, I'm going to try it out. I've been kind of chicken about actually trying my Spanish with real Spanish-speaking people. So I thanked them, and I was able, with what I had practiced, to say, I said, aprendo español. I'm learning Spanish. Their jaws dropped open. And so we were able to have a bit of a basic conversation. And the food kept coming. And it still has. The last time was a couple of weeks ago. It was a real nice homemade guacamole and this shaved beef that's really nicely seasoned. And it was just so gracious of them. And we have a little grandson now who's 2, and he comes over a lot and plays in the backyard. And Jose always wants to make a fuss over him and to connect with him, and we're delighted that Logan can have that experience. So on one afternoon, Jose was saying, because we kind of help each other out with language, and he says, Peter, what means vecino in English? And I said, well, that's the word for neighbor. He said, you are good neighbors, you are buenos vecinos. And that made me feel very warm inside. And so now we have a story about someone who asked Jesus the question, who is my neighbor? And I know that my friends here are going to help us fill that out and explore it further.
Yeah. So it's Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Most people have heard this story. It's a great parable that Jesus teaches us through this parable of the way of the kingdom. There's so many ways that Jesus tries to clamor into our lives to give us examples, real life examples of the coming kingdom, this different life that we can be a part of through him. To be a part of loving behavior, like Pastor Bob, you said before, to love is the hardest thing. And so Jesus continually reminds us about this and how we can participate in this creative process of joining him in the kingdom. Who was a neighbor to the man in need? Not the likely candidates, not the one who shouldn't have, the one who was regarded with hostility, the alien far from home. The one who stopped to help was that person. So Pam, I know you have the first comment. You are waiting to give us the first comment for today. You go.
Well, not only am I waiting, I'm grateful, and I am grateful to my partners here for letting me take this one, because out of all of our studies in this Podtalk process, I feel like this is the one that speaks most to me, but also perhaps the easiest to understand. These podcasts are about generosity and growing in generosity as individuals and as a faith community. And so in preparing for this session, I read a commentator's discussion about altruistic generosity. And I want to define it the way he did define it for all of us, where the giver expects nothing in return from the recipient. He called altruistic generosity subversive and radical. It's more common, and not very Christ-like, for donors or benefactors to expect something in return for the generosity, whether they admit it or not. They expect a thank you note. They expect effusive gratitude from someone. They expect someone to change their behavior as a result of some generous act on our part. Or, to be very current, pictures they can share on Facebook. But this Christian generosity, this altruistic generosity, calls on us to give and expect nothing in return. We've been given two great commandments: to love God with all that we have, and to love our neighbor and care for them just as we love and care for ourselves, our friends and our family, the way Peter's neighbor is caring for him. To me, generosity is love in action. You talk about love being hard to do. Generosity, I think, puts action behind our love. The Good Samaritan parable, to me, challenges us to actively love our neighbor, pointing out that our neighbor isn't necessarily someone we know or love or even like. Our neighbor may even be someone who despises us or someone we dislike. So then who is our neighbor? Is it the person next door? Is it the immigrant or the refugee? Is it families in Libya who lost loved ones in floods and breaking dams? And is it easier to love strangers who are far away and merely an idea than it is to love the person who lives in Bussy Woods and disrupts our idyllic walk? Or the person of a different color, race, ethnicity, religion that we work with? I would ask, who isn't our neighbor? And I think that's what God would ask us as well. Who is not your neighbor? So we've been commanded to love all of God's children, and all of God's children are our neighbors, to show them altruistic love generously without expecting anything in return. Many of you know I worked in human services for my entire career, and so people often ask me about the people we worked with, and in particular would ask about what they should do when someone begs for money at an intersection or on the train or at Jewel. And I honestly don't know if there's a good answer with regard to what works best from the perspective of addressing panhandling. Should you give cash? Should you take them to a grocery store? Should you ignore the panhandling? For me, in this context and in this lesson, I think the answer is not about what works best for them, but what it says about me, and what does God want me to do when confronted with someone's need. What does it say about me if I turn a blind eye, if I ignore them and walk on the other side of the street, or even yell at them to leave me alone? I don't think God would be pleased with me, and I don't think that's what living generously looks like. I don't think that's what love of God and my neighbor looks like. So doing nothing, actively doing nothing, is what everyone but the Good Samaritan did in our text that you're studying today. And yet, there is so much need. There's no way we can respond to it all. I can't. No one can. Our church can't. So many things calling for our attention and support that it can be overwhelming and paralyzing to try to figure out what is the right thing to do. What does living generously in the face of so much demand look like? Nadia Bolz-Weber, a Lutheran pastor who calls herself the sarcastic Lutheran, suggested an answer that makes sense to me, which is why I remembered it. She said, pick one thing. We can't do everything, so pick one thing. My answer to the question of who is my neighbor and what is the best thing to do when someone is panhandling is to say, pick one thing. You can give them money freely, and don't worry about what they do with it. That's radical and subversive generosity. Or give money to a charity that addresses homelessness and mental illness, or volunteer at our food pantry or pads. Do a loving, generous thing, not a guilty thing. Now, admittedly, we might have to practice that, because that's easier said than done. But like in AA and other self-help groups, we fake it till we make it. And you just keep practicing and practicing, giving generously and loving generously. So loving generously, giving without expectations, is without expectations of anything in return, is the radical thing. Generosity cannot coexist with judgment. It's not generosity if we only give to deserving, needy people. It's not love if we only love lovable people. Then that's just a transaction or a trade. So the Good Samaritan was not repaid for his kindness. He doesn't even have a name. We can't even thank him if we wanted to. So how different would our lives be if we even tried to do that? How different would the world be if we loved our neighbors as ourselves, or loved our neighbors as a Good Samaritan loved his neighbor, his enemy? That sounds like radical generosity to me. So I ask you guys, what does radical generosity sound like to you?
You know, I think sometimes we just need to see it for what it is, and it's surprising to us, and it's not always in the places that we think it needs to be or should be. So I'll tell you a story about a kindergartner, and this kindergarten happens to be my granddaughter, Addison. And last year she was, starting school, all excited. And we found out after about 3 weeks that she had had an interaction with another kindergarten student. And this other student was a special needs girl. And Addison evidently, during lunchtime, noticed that she was upset and struggling and just really was having a difficult time. And she got up, and to my knowledge, she didn't know her before this, school. She got up and went over and sat next to her, and and immediately they had a connection. Unfortunately, this other girl, this one with special needs, there was also a lot of health concerns. And what we found out later was that her life expectancy, she had already exceeded how long she should have survived from the condition that she had. So partway through the kindergarten year last year, she passed away. Oh. And it just, now all of a sudden, we're having this conversation with a 5-year-old. And I'll be honest with you, it's one thing to talk to a 5-year-old, it's another to talk to her parents, because they weren't sure what to do and what to say and everything. What they found out, though, was that during the school time, what they didn't know was that oftentimes when this little girl would be having a difficult time, because she wasn't always in the class, she was sometimes in a special classroom and then would be introduced into the class to mainstream. But when she was having a particularly difficult time, the nurse oftentimes would call down to Addison's class and ask if Addison could come down to the nurse's office. And what the nurse told our son and daughter-in-law was that when Addison walked in the room, immediately, however challenging that little girl's life was that day, she would just calm down and to be able to do that.
She's a good Samaritan.
Yeah, and so, you think about it's not something maybe, I don't know, it just felt so natural in that here are two young ones and they can figure it out, and we wonder sometimes why is it so difficult, for us as adults, again, we maybe overthink, or we think it should be this or it should be that. I think, Pam, you were spot on. Sometimes we have this idea that people, if they're not deserving, then they shouldn't be on the receiving end of kindness and so forth. I remember a gentleman one time said that he was dealing with his aging father, and he said, charity is when I buy my dad his diapers. That's charity, okay? He said, compassion is when I'm willing to change him. And I thought, wow, so, sometimes to be a good neighbor isn't always to a stranger, I guess is what I'm, it can be, but it doesn't have to be, so.
Wow, it's a very powerful story with your granddaughter. I was thinking about several stories come to my mind as well, but I think it's no coincidence that Jesus uses a Samaritan. He could have picked any other, it's a parable, a story, but he chooses the Samaritan. And the Samaritan at the time was a person who was outside of the chosen ones. And the other examples, the priest and the Levite, and they're all insiders, and they should all know what to do, the right thing to do, and they all passed. They were busy, but the Samaritan did it, and he took time to stop. Very, very moving and touching that. So Bob and I, we are motorcycle buddies, so we like motorcycling, and years ago, Mel and I took vacation, and our goal was to drive around the big lakes, Michigan, Superior. And first day we got started late after church Sunday, super hot day, and made it down to Gary and on 80 and heading towards Michigan. And it was a lot of traffic, and then it loosened it up, and I was ready to accelerate, and then I noticed my rear was going like this, and I knew this wasn't good. So not good at all. So I made it safely to the right side, and I noticed, picked up a nail screw actually in the tire. We only have two wheels, two tires, so if you lose one, it's not so good. So I stood there, man, and he said, "So now what? Now what? Is it over now?" I said, No. I know what to do. So I got the screw out, and I put a plug in. And then she said, "Now what? Now what? You have no air." And as she was asking all these questions, someone stopped with another motorcycle. And he was an African-American motorcyclist. I think it was a Goldwing. And I said, "Oh, it's all good." He said, "No, it's not all good. I'm waiting until the bike has air again." So I had a CO2 cartridge, filled it up, and he said, "I will guide you to the next gas station." And I didn't know where the next gas station is and getting off the expressway. And so he said, "No, I will guide you. You follow me." And we followed him. He drove very slow. We made it to the gas station and got real air in it. And then he made sure, the plug holds up, and wished us well. And he was so caring, so good to us, and said beautiful words. And I said, "I thank you so much." And I never forget this. So I share this story because I was a recipient, and I see it many, many times at church when other people are good Samaritans and share these stories. And I think it's one of the most caring, most powerful stories we have in the New Testament. And this, most people know about the Good Samaritan, but don't know it's actually from the Bible. But if we practice this more and more, and watch out for others, and be there and walk alongside with them, this would make a huge difference in our world. So
Pam, you said that generosity has to take place without judgment being part of it. Am I correct?
Radical generosity.
And that's actually pretty hard to do that all the time. And I suppose what that says for me is that looking at myself and the judgments that I make without realizing it, that's an important part if I'm going to answer God's call to generosity. That's an important part of it, because there are all kinds of hidden judgments, things we've picked up along the way in life, things we've formed from our own experience, and sometimes some judgments that we share as society or as a cultural group or even as a church, sad to say, that we need to shed those judgments. And that's an ongoing process. But I think what you've said has encouraged me, the importance of doing that, and that there is hope, as always.
Yep.
Thanks.
All right. Anyone else have other tidbits, other stories? That was a good one. Yeah? All right. We shoot it back to you. Go to cvlutheran.org/generoushearts and access the discussion questions. Launch into them. They're very thought-provoking. You could talk for hours on them. Abundant life that really is life. Here we come. See you next time on Podtalk.